Hello there my very good friends, it's Andy Murray here for What Culture Wrestling, back again with another breakdown of another premium slice of pro wrestling content, and today we are talking about the latest episode of Stone Cold's Broken Skull Sessions featuring Ric Flair. Now of course you can watch this on the award-winning WWE Network right now, and I would suggest you do. It is, well, it's tremendous, and of course it is. It's got Ric bloody Flair on it. He had one of the longest pro wrestling careers at a high level ever. Many consider him the best wrestler ever, and as you can imagine, yeah, the man's got quite a few stories. Now of course, covering the full breadth of a man like Flair's career in a single interview is impossible, but Steve Austin does a tremendous job here. He drags out some really emotional, contemplative stuff from the Nature Boy. So with that in mind, let's get to it. I'm Andy for What Culture Wrestling, and here are 10 things that we learned from Ric Flair on Stone Cold's Broken Skull Sessions. Number 10, his advice to wrestlers today. On previous episodes of the Broken Skull Sessions, we have seen Big Show, we've seen Undertaker talk about today's wrestling and the WWE locker room needing to slow things down. Now Flair goes into this on a wider scale. He talks about pro wrestling in general, and he talks about the widening gap between spots and selling. Flair believes that the art of selling has largely been lost in the name of flips, dives, super kicks, spots and other oft-repeated moves. And he says it's a real shame because there's loads of world-class workers out there, they're just not necessarily thinking about the space between those moves. And he doesn't mention specific names, which is a good thing. He doesn't want to bury anyone outright, more make a general point about how the sport is progressing. And I think this is a point that will resonate with a lot of people viewing this. He's touching on something that loads and loads of people believe in. It's a very prominent criticism of modern wrestling, and hey man, when it comes from a guy like Ric Flair, I mean, who's gonna doubt him, right? It's Ric Flair. Number 9, he apologized to Vince McMahon for his TNA run. At one point in the interview, we get Steve Austin asking Ric what he thought of his run in TNA. Now this was highly controversial at the time. Ric was treated really well on his way out of WWE. He got the big retirement match, the big blow-off with Shawn Michaels. I'm sorry, I love you, and all that. They really rolled out the red carpet for him on his way out. Then of course, Flair ends up going to TNA. And then Flair wrestles for TNA, and suddenly that retirement is undone. Now of course, no pro wrestling retirement ever really sticks, but it's easy to see why a guy like Vince McMahon might be upset by Flair doing that, given the effort that was put into his big farewell. So when Flair came back to WWE, when he was back in their good graces, one of the things he did was seek Vince out almost immediately and apologise for what had happened. He said TNA meant nothing to him. He said that working for Eric Bischoff again was a nightmare, and that the only reason he did it was because he needed the cash. As he looks back on it, Flair's TNA run apparently just doesn't mean a whole lot to him. He was there only to ease his growing financial problems, and when he speaks about this and when you go back and look at some of the clips from his work there, it kind of shows. Number 8, Harley Race told Ric that he was embarrassing himself. So let's take it back to STARRCADE 93 for a second. Ric was there, he was wrestling Vader in a pretty awesome and widely acclaimed match. Now, Harley Race was Vader's manager at the time, and he had some stern criticism for Ric, and he didn't even wait until after the bout. He laid it down at ringside, screaming in his ear as this thing was going on. What did Harley say? "You're embarrassing yourself and you're embarrassing me." He was genuinely concerned. This wasn't a work, by the way. He was genuinely concerned that Flair was out there and he wasn't looking like Flair. He said that he needed to step things up, get himself in gear, and give Vader something to chew on. Now it seemed to work. Ric said that he fired up, he blasted the big man with a couple of stiff shots, and from there he was off to the races. Now after the match, he actually spoke to Harley about it. He said, "Man, I just haven't been myself lately. I'm not really enjoying working babyface here, but did Race have that? Did he accept that?" Well, no, of course he didn't. He's one of the legendary pro wrestling hardmen, and he told him in no uncertain terms, get it together. And hey man, when Harley Race tells you to get it together, you get it together. Number 7, the hilarious Moonsault story. Ric's late son Reed was a huge Shawn Michaels fan, and one day, after seeing Shawn perform a moonsault on TV, he came up to his dad, Reed did, and he said, "Hey dad, can you do that move? Go and do a moonsault for me. So Ric Flair, if you've ever watched one of his matches, you know that that's not exactly his style. But he took it as a real kick in the nads for his pride. So what Flair did was he went to his daughter Ashley, that's Charlotte to me and you, he went to her gymnastics coach and said, hey man, can you like strap me into a harness? I want to figure out how to do this move for my son. But as he was training this thing, he realized that maybe he was taking a harmless throwaway comment about HBK way to heart, and he decided the whole thing was stupid. He called it off and realized that S.A. Rios, he is not. Now, Rick never said when exactly this went down, but given that Reed was born in 1988, it's pretty easy to see why Shawn Michaels, a super athlete and one of the most eye-catching wrestlers at the time, would be one of his favourites, because after all, business evolves. Number 6, Flair never asked about WrestleMania 8. One of the great lost matches in WrestleMania history is, of course, Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan, the ultimate dream match. Now, that was scrapped. Coming out of the 1992 Royal Rumble, WWE went in a completely different direction, and the working rumour at the time, and well, today as well, is that the house show stint they did, they worked together on top for a while on the road, and it just didn't do good business. Now, given that he was directly involved in this situation, you might think that Rick would have insider knowledge on why the match went down. But he didn't. In fact, he didn't even ask Vince why it was scrapped. He was too busy focusing on his craft to really care about the damn thing. Instead of moping about losing the Hogan match, he wanted to get the best possible bout with Randy Savage that he possibly could. And hey, that's a pretty damn tremendous match, to be fair to him. Now, when Rick focuses on the reasons on the podcast, he speculates that the cancellation probably had more to do with Hogan and his fracturing relationship with Vince than anything else. Noting that if they did do bad business on that house show tour, well, nobody told him. Number 5, who hated his chops the most? The Undertaker. It was The Undertaker. So when these guys were about to work together in 2002, Undertaker went up to Flair and told him, "You got 3 of these things." That's how many chops the dead man was willing to take from the Nature Boy, because these things were very real, they were very impactful, and they probably hurt a lot. Undertaker apparently half joked that he wouldn't be best pleased if Flair went overboard and started chopping the piss out of him, and hey, he wasn't the only one who hated taking the chops. Bret Hart was another one. He was all about prioritizing his body and staying safe above all else, and the chops really hurt, so he didn't want to do them when they worked together. But these guys aside from these 2 legends of the business, Flair couldn't recall anyone else who didn't want to take his signature chops. In fact, he said that most people were more than happy. It was almost like a badge of honor taking these flesh-rending strikes from the legendary Nature Boy, and at the end of the day, most people were just glad for the chance to work with him. Number 4, he doubted himself during his entrance at WrestleMania 18. During that very same Undertaker feud of 2002, Flair was having a massive crisis of confidence. It was stopping him from having the kind of matches he felt he was still capable of. And this is something that has been touched on by Chris Jericho in the past. In one of his books, he says that Flair came up to him after working with him that same year and saying, "Hey man, thanks for helping me get through that." So for that feud, The Undertaker approached Triple H and asked him to gauge Rick's interest in working a feud. Now Rick was honoured, he was very flattered, but at the same time, he was kinda worried. In fact, Rick was fretting about it so much it was actually stuck in his head during his ring entrance for the match at WrestleMania. He had the goddamn butterflies and he couldn't shake them off until The Undertaker damn near kicked his head off with a big boot on the apron. Now this came seconds after Rick had just botched his signature flippy dippy over the top rope to the outside spot. And while the big boot seemed to stem off some of the butterflies, Rick called himself a cosmetic nightmare at the time and couldn't help but reflect what kind of match he could have given The Undertaker had he not been feeling so low. Number 3, HBK telling him to shut up. So fast forward 6 years and Ric Flair is preparing to work his final match in WWE at WrestleMania 24. Shawn Michaels is his opponent. While Shawn was a living legend himself, you know, generally speaking, in situations like this, the veteran calls the action, right? Well, not this time around. When Flair approached Michaels to run through what they might want to do in the match, Shawn effectively said, "Don't say a word, just leave it all to me." Now, to be fair, Michaels isn't exactly a bad guy to be following from, but this totally took Ric off his game, to the point where he tried to converse with Michaels in the opening lockup. And what did Shawn say? "I thought I told you to shut up." It was a really jarring experience for a man who had spent decades controlling the action, setting the pace in the ring, and it took him a good 15 minutes before Ric could get over that, but by the end of it, you could tell he was working with a true master of the craft, and he was just in awe of Shawn's performance. He said it was almost like HBK was wrestling himself. So, knowing that, and thinking about it a little bit, and considering that Michaels told Flair to shut up, kind of recontextualizes that spot, that "I'm sorry, I love you" a little bit. Maybe not entirely, but it's interesting to think about. Number 2, the coolest moment of Vince McMahon's life. So everybody has a built-up image or assumption of Vince McMahon, be it a cold-hearted billionaire who only sleeps 2 hours a night and hates sneezing, or whatever else you may have in mind. And hearing all these stories, hearing all the wacky tales of all the crazy crap he's done in the past, it's really easy to forget that behind all that, behind the bluster, behind the bravado, there's probably a human being lurking in there somewhere. One such story that provides a good example of that comes from the 2002 Royal Rumble. Flair and Vince are getting ready to work their match, and Vince, the WWE chairman, he takes the Nature Boy aside and he says with a tear in his goddamn eye that this was an honor. This was one of the coolest moments of his life. And this set Ric off as well. That Flair was actually crying when he told this story on Broken Skull Sessions itself, I think really says it all. It shows that him and Vince really connected through that, and that McMahon, for all the bluster and maybe the blow-ups they'd had at various points throughout their career, he deeply respected Ric as one of the best to ever do it. And that kind of ties in with our last point as well. Number 1, how he wants to be remembered. Ric Flair is the very first person to admit that in his prime years he was maybe a little bit out of control. We've heard all the stories of the partying, the womanizing, and the racking up a claustrophobic, smothering mountain of debt. But is that how the Nature Boy wants to be remembered? Does he want to be remembered as a guy who lived the Playboy gimmick? No. While recalling these memories is fun to Flair, they have a lot of bad things attached to them as well, and to be fair, to his credit, he isn't running away from them. He even writes them off as products of ego, excess, and selfishness. And instead of permanently being associated with them, Flair would rather be remembered for the performer he was between the ropes and the memories he created throughout a wonderful pro wrestling career. Today, in 2020, he's just happy to be alive. He's happy to have this second chance and to live vicariously through his daughter Charlotte and her own accomplishments. So he requests that you don't remember him for that bad stuff, you remember him for the dedication and the body of work. Anyway guys, that's it, my take on another episode of Steve Austin's Broken Skull Sessions, which I think at the moment is probably one of the biggest reasons to shell out that $9.99 a month. So load it up on your little network and have some fun. It's a great watch. Now, of course, you can like this video, you can share it, you can subscribe to the channel, you can ring the bell for notifications. That would be nice, but I'm not your dad. Do what you want, man. And if you also want, you can follow us on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE and myself at Andy H. Murray if you want to tell me how much you want to chop me in the chest or something. Woo. Yeah, just bye.